Hey buddy, welcome back. Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little higher if you need to. Dim the lights or turn them off completely if that is where you are right now. Wherever you are listening from, whatever kind of day you had, none of that needs to follow you into this one. Tonight we are not in a hurry to get anywhere. I want you to imagine a narrow stone path, slick with rain, cut into the side of a mountain so steep that the clouds sit below your feet instead of above your head. It is the summer of 1911, though up here, in the eastern slopes of the Peruvian Andes, summer does not mean warmth. It means mist. It means the kind of cold that gets into your knuckles and stays there. A man is climbing this path not because he is looking for a lost city. He does not believe in lost cities. He is looking for a different ruin entirely, one mentioned in old Spanish documents, a place called Vitcos. He has a mule, a translator, a sergeant loaned to him by the local government, and a farmer who has agreed, for the price of about 50 cents, to show him a shortcut. The farmer does not think he is leading anyone toward anything important. To him, the ruins on the ridge above are just the ruins on the ridge above. His family has known about them for years. People farm near them. Children have probably played in them. Nobody has written a book about them because, as far as anyone standing on that mountain that morning is concerned, there is nothing to write. By the end of that day, everything about how the world understands the Inca Empire will begin slowly to change. Not with a shout, not with a headline, with a boy, a farmer's son, leading a tired American professor up a final stretch of trail, past a spring, through some brush, and into a silence that has been sitting undisturbed for close to 400 years. That is where we are going tonight, not to the drama of discovery, because there was surprisingly little drama in it. We are going to the ordinary, the terraces, the kitchens, the stone doorways worn smooth by hands that are long gone, the quiet, working, breathing city that existed on that mountaintop centuries before anyone thought to call it lost. So settle in, let your eyes close if they want to, and let's go find this place together, slowly, the way it was actually found. If this is your first time here, I am glad you found your way to this fireside. This channel, The Quiet Past, is built around a simple idea. Most of history is not made of famous speeches or great battles. Most of history is made of ordinary mornings, someone waking up cold, someone stirring a pot, someone repairing a wall that has needed repairing for a week. We spend our time here in that ordinary layer of the past, the part that rarely makes it into the textbooks, because that is where most people actually lived, and honestly, it is where the best stories tend to hide. If you enjoy this kind of slow, unhurried journey through history, consider subscribing. It costs nothing. It helps this little channel keep finding these stories, and it means you will not lose track of us the next time we settle down by the fire. You do not need to do anything else. Just let the video keep playing. There is no quiz at the end. There is nowhere you need to be. Tonight's story concerns a mountain city in Peru that the outside world would eventually come to know by the name Machu Picchu, though as we will get into a little later, that may not even be the name its own people used for it. It is often described as a lost city, discovered by an intrepid explorer hacking his way through untouched jungle. That description makes for a good adventure movie. It is also, in several important ways, not quite what happened. The truth is quieter. It is a story about local farming families who never really lost track of the place at all. It is a story about a Yale historian named Hiram Bingham III, who was not even looking for this particular ruin when he found it, and who almost did not bother climbing the last stretch of trail because it was raining and he was tired. And underneath both of those threads, it is the story of the ordinary people, the farmers, the stonemasons, the weavers, the priests, and the household servants, who once lived their entire lives on that mountain, cooking meals, raising children, and watching the mist roll through the peaks around them, centuries before any of that ever mattered to a map maker in another hemisphere. We are going to take our time with all of it. We will start with the actual day of the rediscovery, since it is a much stranger and more understated story than most people realize. Then we are going to step backward in time, all the way to around the year 1450, and spend a good long while inside the city while it was alive. We will walk its terraces. We will sit in on a meal. We will watch its stonemasons work. And then gently we will walk back through its abandonment, its long silence, and the slow process by which the world came to know about it again. There is no need to remember any of it. Just let it wash over you. Let's begin. A man who was looking for something else. Let's start with the man himself, because understanding what he was actually looking for makes the whole story land differently. Hiram Bingham III was not, at the time, a famous explorer. He was a lecturer at Yale University, a historian by training, and if we are being fully honest with each other tonight, a man with a fairly large and restless ambition. He had grown up the son of missionaries in Hawaii, had studied at Yale and later at Harvard, and had married into the Tiffany family, the same Tiffany of the jewelry stores, which meant that money was not, for once, the limiting factor in his adventures. What he lacked was not funding. What he lacked was a great discovery to put his name on. In 1908, a few years before our story really gets going, Bingham had traveled through South America attending a scientific conference in Chile, and on his way back he had passed through Peru. He had visited a Spanish colonial town called Abanque, and while he was there, a local prefect mentioned an old Inca ruin nearby called Chaquiquero. Bingham visited it, was captivated, and came away with an idea that would define much of the next decade of his life. He believed that somewhere in these mountains, hidden by jungle and time, there might still be ruins that had never been properly studied by a historian. Not undiscovered by local people, mind you, undiscovered by the academic world that published books and drew maps and decided what counted as known. This distinction matters more than it might seem to at first. Almost nothing in these mountains was truly lost to the people who lived there. Farmers walked past ruins on their way to their fields. Shepherds grazed animals near crumbling walls. Local families sometimes even used old Inca terraces to grow their own crops because the terracing was, frankly, excellent, and no one saw any reason to let good farmland go to waste just because it happened to be 400 years old. What was missing was not local knowledge. What was missing was the connection between that local knowledge and the wider world of academic geography, a world centered at the time in places like New Haven, Connecticut, and London and Paris. By 1911, Bingham had assembled something called the Yale Peruvian Expedition, funded partly by Yale and partly by the National Geographic Society, a partnership that would matter quite a lot to how this story eventually reached the public. His stated goal for the expedition was to find the last capital of the Inca resistance, a city called Vilcabamba, sometimes referred to in old Spanish accounts as Vitcos, where the final Inca rulers had fled after the Spanish conquest and had held out for decades before eventually being captured. I want you to imagine for a moment what this kind of expedition actually looked like on the ground, because it was far less glamorous than the phrase Yale Peruvian Expedition might suggest. There was Bingham himself. There was a naturalist and a few other academics attached to the mission. There was a translator, since Bingham's Spanish was serviceable but not fluent, and the local Quechua-speaking farmers he needed to talk to did not speak Spanish either, in many cases, so information sometimes had to pass through two languages before it reached him. There was a Peruvian government official, Sergeant Carrasco, assigned to accompany the group, partly for their protection and partly, one suspects, so the government could keep an eye on what a group of well-funded Americans were doing wandering around remote mountain valleys. And there was the weather. Late July in this part of Peru sits in the dry season, technically, but dry season in the high Andes still means cold nights, sudden fog, and rain that can arrive without much warning and soak through wool ponchos in minutes. The expedition was moving along the Urubamba River Valley, a deep gorge cut by a river that the local Quechua people called by a name that translates roughly to Sacred River, following old trade routes and asking at every settlement they passed whether anyone knew of ruins nearby. On the night of July 23rd, the expedition made camp near a spot along the river called Mandor Pampa, and it was here, over dinner, that a local farmer and innkeeper named Melchor Artiga mentioned, almost in passing, that there were some ruins on top of a nearby mountain. Good ruins, he said, better than some of the others they had been shown. Bingham later described this conversation as one of many similar conversations he had had throughout the trip. Nearly every local farmer he spoke with knew of some ruins somewhere. Most of these ruins turned out to be minor, a few scattered walls, not much more. Bingham had no particular reason to believe this mention of ruins near a peak called Machu Picchu, meaning Old Mountain in Quechua, would be any different from the dozen similar leads he had already chased that summer. It was raining the next morning. Bingham, by his own account, was not eager to climb. He had a fever, or at least felt unwell, and the idea of hauling himself up a wet, overgrown mountainside for what would probably turn out to be a handful of tumbled stones did not exactly thrill him. Let's sit with that for a moment. I want you to imagine being in his position. You have traveled thousands of miles. You are cold, slightly feverish, and mildly annoyed at the rain. Someone tells you there might be some old rocks on top of a mountain. It's how many of us on a morning like that would have said tomorrow maybe, let's see how the weather looks. But Bingham went anyway. Melchor Artiga agreed to guide him for the fee of one Peruvian soul, worth about 50 American cents at the time, which by any measure is one of the great historical bargains of the 20th century. Sergeant Carrasco came along as well. The three of them, plus at some point a young boy from a nearby household, made their way down to the river, crossed it on a rather precarious log bridge that Bingham later described with visible discomfort, and began the climb. The path, such as it was, zigzagged steeply up through wet jungle. It took the better part of 2 hours. Along the way, they passed a small hut where a family named Richart and another named Alvarez were living. These families, it turned out, had been farming terraces near the ruins for a few years already, growing corn and other vegetables on the ancient stone platforms because, again, the soil there was excellent and the terracing did the hard work of managing water and erosion that would have taken the families themselves years to build from scratch on their own. I want you to really absorb that detail, because it is one of the quiet, human centerpieces of this whole story. When Hiram Bingham arrived at what the world would later call a lost city, there were already people living there. Not amid its ruins in some picturesque, romantic sense, but practically in the way people have always used good land. A family's children, according to some later accounts, were the ones who ended up guiding Bingham through the last stretch of overgrown ruins that morning, since they knew the site better than anyone, having played among its walls their entire young lives. So who exactly discovered Machu Picchu in 1911? Melchor Artiga, who knew the way and needed 50 cents. Sergeant Carrasco, sent along by his government. A family of farmers already living on site, whose children led an American academic through weeds and vines to see stonework they had known about their whole lives. And Hiram Bingham, cold and mildly feverish, who happened to be the one person in that small group who would go home and write books about it, lecture about it, and eventually convince the National Geographic Society to devote an entire issue of its magazine to the story. This is often how discovery actually works in history. It is rarely a single, dramatic moment of an individual standing where no human being has ever stood. It is far more often a moment where information that already existed in one community finally crosses into another community that has the means to record it, publish it, and broadcast it to the wider world. That crossing point is worth remembering because it happens more often in history than most of us assume, and it happened right here, on a wet Andean morning in July of 1911. Let's follow them the rest of the way up that trail and see exactly what they found. What was actually found that morning? Imagine this for a moment. You have been climbing for nearly 2 hours. Your boots are soaked through. The jungle around you is thick, the kind of green that seems to swallow sound, heavy with moisture, loud with insects you cannot see. Your guide, a farmer half your age in mountain terms though probably not in calendar years, moves easily along a path that to you looks like no path at all. And then, quite suddenly, the vegetation opens up and you are standing among stone walls. Not a single wall, not a scattering of rubble, the kind Bingham had grown used to seeing on this trip. Whole structures, doorways still standing, their lintels intact, staircases still climbing between terraces, windows framing views of mountains that on a clearer day would stretch out in every direction, and the stonework itself fitted together so precisely, without any mortar at all, that in places you could not have slid a knife blade between two blocks. Bingham later wrote about this moment with the kind of restrained, understated language that historians of a certain era favored, but you can feel, underneath the formal sentences, that he understood almost immediately he was looking at something significant. Not a minor outpost, not a farming hamlet, something that had been an important place, built with enormous care and enormous labor by people who intended for it to last. He was right about the lasting part, at least. It had lasted. It had simply been waiting. The site was heavily overgrown, and this detail matters because it explains something people often get wrong about this story. Machu Picchu was not swallowed by jungle in the sense of a city being buried and forgotten under earth. The stone structures themselves had never been buried. They stood in the open air the entire time, visible to anyone who climbed high enough to see them, which the local farming families obviously had, since they were living and working right there. What had happened was that centuries of tropical vegetation, vines, small trees, thick grasses, had grown up around and over many of the walls, softening their outlines, filling their courtyards, turning stone plazas into green clearings that needed clearing before their shape could be understood again. Bingham spent that first day exploring what he could see, taking photographs and making initial notes. He found a caretaker's hut still occupied, in a sense, by the very families we already talked about, the Richart and Alvarez households, who by this point had cleared some of the terraces for their own crops. He climbed to what would later be called the Intihuatana stone, a carved ritual pillar near the highest point of the city, and he found evidence of what he believed correctly to be a significant royal or religious site. What he did not find, at least not that first day, was any definitive proof of what the place actually was, or who had built it, or why. That would take years of subsequent excavation, and honestly, some of the biggest questions about Machu Picchu's exact purpose are still debated among historians and archaeologists today, more than a century later. Bingham's own theory that this was the lost city of Vilcabamba, the last refuge of the Inca resistance he had originally set out to find, turned out to be wrong. Vilcabamba was a real place, and it was eventually identified at a different, more remote site called Espiritu Pampa, one that Bingham himself had actually visited briefly on this same expedition, without fully appreciating what he was looking at. So in a strange twist, Bingham found the wrong lost city, and the right lost city on the very same trip, and initially mixed up which was which. It would take other researchers, decades later, comparing colonial-era Spanish documents against the physical evidence at both sites, to sort out that Machu Picchu was something else entirely. Not the last refuge of a defeated empire, but very likely a royal estate built during the height of Inca power, a private retreat for one of history's most successful emperors. We will get to who that emperor was and what this place actually meant to him a little later. For now, I want you to sit with the image of that first afternoon, an overgrown mountaintop, a tired historian with a fever, a handful of local guides who already knew the way. Yen stone walls standing quietly in the mist, exactly where they had always stood, waiting simply for someone to write it all down. Let's step back now, further than 1911, further even than the Spanish conquest, and go find out who actually built this place, and what it was like to live there while it was still full of life. The emperor who built a mountain retreat to understand Machu Picchu. We need to go back roughly 460 years before Hiram Bingham ever set foot on that trail, to around the year 1450, during the reign of an Inca emperor named Pachacuti. Pachacuti is one of those historical figures who, if he had operated in Europe or Asia, would likely be as widely known as any conquering king or empire-building emperor from those regions. His name itself is telling. Pachacuti roughly translates to something like "he who remakes the world," or cataclysm, depending on which scholar you ask, and it was a name he adopted rather than one he was born with, which tells you something about the scale of ambition we are dealing with. Before Pachacuti, the Inca were one power among several in the central Andes, based around the city of Cusco, but not yet the sprawling empire we associate with the name today. According to Inca oral tradition, later recorded by Spanish chroniclers after the conquest, Pachacuti came to power following a dramatic moment when a rival group called the Chenca threatened to overrun Cusco itself. Pachacuti's father, the reigning emperor at the time, along with Pachacuti's older brother, the heir apparent, apparently fled the city rather than face the Chenca army. Pachacuti, according to this tradition, refused to flee, rallied the city's defenders, and won a decisive victory that saved Cusco and, not incidentally, positioned him to eventually take the throne from his own father and brother. We should hold this story a little loosely, the way we hold most origin stories that come down to us through oral tradition later written down by the very people who benefited from the story being told a certain way. But whatever the precise truth of Pachacuti's rise, what followed is well documented by both archaeological evidence and Spanish colonial records. Pachacuti began an extraordinary campaign of expansion and construction that, within a few generations, would turn Cusco from a regional power into the center of the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas, stretching eventually from present-day Colombia down through Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and into Argentina. And somewhere in the middle of this expansion, likely sometime in the 1450s or 1460s, Pachacuti ordered the construction of a private estate on a remote mountain ridge above the Urubamba River, in a region that today we call the Sacred Valley, a fertile valley system that was already important to Inca agriculture and religion before Machu Picchu was ever built. Why here specifically? This is one of those questions historians have spent decades chewing on, and the honest answer is that we have strong theories rather than absolute certainty, since the Inca left no written language behind in the way we typically think of writing. They used a system called quipu, knotted cords that recorded numerical and possibly narrative information, but which modern scholars still cannot fully read. Much of what we know about Inca intentions comes from archaeological analysis combined with Spanish colonial accounts, which were written by outsiders, often decades after the fact, and which carry their own biases and misunderstandings. That said, the leading theory, and one most archaeologists find quite convincing, is that Machu Picchu functioned as a royal estate, a kind of country retreat built specifically for Pachacuti and his household, along with the religious and support staff needed to maintain it. Not a military outpost, not primarily a defensive fortress, despite what the dramatic mountain setting might suggest to modern eyes. A place of retreat, ceremony, and, in a sense, personal legacy. Consider the location for a moment and imagine what it would have meant to an Inca ruler at the height of his power. The site sits at roughly 7,900 feet above sea level, lower than Cusco itself, which meant a slightly warmer, more temperate climate, gentler on aging bodies and better suited to certain crops that would not grow well in Cusco's higher, colder air. It sits on a narrow ridge between two peaks, Machu Picchu Mountain, meaning Old Peak, and Huayna Picchu, meaning Young Peak, with the Urubamba River curling around the base of the mountain in a horseshoe bend far below. From certain points within the city, the surrounding mountains align with the rising and setting sun at specific times of year, particularly around the solstices, in ways that many researchers believe were deliberately incorporated into the design. I want you to imagine standing where Pachacuti likely stood, surveying this site before construction ever began. You are looking at a mountain ridge, forested, remote, several days' travel from Cusco along mountain trails. You are, we can reasonably assume, a man who has just spent years conquering rival kingdoms, expanding an empire, and consolidating power through a combination of military force, strategic marriage alliances, and religious authority, since Inca emperors were considered descendants of the sun god Inti and held both political and spiritual power simultaneously. And you decide that this remote, beautiful, difficult-to-reach mountain will be where you build something entirely for yourself and your closest circle. Not a fort, not a granary, though it would eventually include those as well. A retreat. There is something quietly relatable in that decision, even across nearly 6 centuries. Even an emperor of the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas wanted a place away from the capital, somewhere beautiful, somewhere his own, where the demands of running an empire could be set aside, at least for a while, in favor of ceremony, hunting, religious observance, and rest. Building it, however, was an entirely different matter than deciding to build it, and the labor required to turn this vision into stone terraces and temples was immense, coordinated across the length of the growing empire through a system that, in itself, tells us a great deal about how ordinary Inca life actually worked. Let's go there next and talk about the people who actually built this place, one stone at a time. The labor that built a mountain city here is something that often surprises people when they first learn about how Inca construction projects actually worked. The Inca did not have a system of paid, professional construction crews in the way we might picture today. They did not use money at all, in fact, in the sense of coins or currency changing hands for goods and services. What they had instead was a system called mita, a form of mandatory labor tax that every household within the empire owed to the state, in place of, rather than alongside, any kind of monetary taxation. Let's imagine what this meant for an ordinary Andean farming family in, say, the 1450s, somewhere in the empire, not necessarily near Machu Picchu itself, since laborers were often drawn from communities across a wide region depending on the scale of a given project. Each household, as part of its obligation to the state, owed a certain number of weeks or months of labor per year. This was not slavery in the sense of permanent hereditary bondage, and it was not, strictly speaking, optional either. It was closer to a rotating civic duty, similar in some ways to how ancient Egyptian corvée labor worked during flood season, or how some ancient societies required military service. The household head, typically a man, though women had their own separate labor obligations involving textile production, would be called upon periodically to leave his fields, travel to wherever the state needed labor that season, and work on whatever project the empire required. Roads, terracing, storage facilities, or, if you happened to be called up during the right years, the construction of an emperor's private mountain retreat. I want you to imagine being one of these laborers, setting out from your home village toward this project. You do not know necessarily that you are building something for the emperor personally. You may not fully grasp the scale of what is being constructed, since you are seeing only your own small piece of it, the section of wall you are assigned to work on, the load of stone you are assigned to carry that particular week. You have left your family behind for this stretch of labor, though the state, to its credit, was expected to provide food and lodging for workers during their mita service, since the labor was owed to the empire, but the empire, in turn, owed subsistence to the laborer while that labor was being performed. This reciprocal quality, obligation flowing in both directions, was actually central to how Inca society understood its own economic relationships, quite different from how we tend to imagine forced labor systems in other historical contexts. The stonework itself is worth pausing on because it remains, even by modern engineering standards, remarkable. Many of Machu Picchu's most important structures, particularly the religious buildings in what is now called the Sacred District, were built using a technique called ashlar masonry, where each stone block is cut and fitted so precisely against its neighbors that no mortar is needed at all. The stones fit together so tightly that, as I mentioned earlier, you genuinely cannot slide even a thin blade between them in many places. How did they achieve this without iron tools, without the wheel used for transport, without draft animals capable of pulling heavy loads the way horses or oxen would in other parts of the world? The Inca had llamas, which are wonderful animals for carrying moderate loads across mountain terrain, but a llama cannot haul a multi-ton stone block up a mountainside. The answer, as best as archaeologists have reconstructed it, involved an enormous amount of coordinated human labor, sophisticated understanding of stone properties, and centuries of accumulated Andean engineering knowledge that predated the Inca themselves. Since earlier cultures in this region, including the Wari and the Tiwanaku, had developed related stoneworking traditions that the Inca inherited and refined. Stones were likely quarried from granite outcroppings on the mountain itself, in some cases from within the construction site or very close to it, which saved enormous transport effort compared to hauling stone from distant quarries. Workers used harder stone hammers to gradually pound and shape softer rock, a slow process of controlled fracturing rather than cutting in the way we might picture with metal chisels. Some evidence suggests they used wooden wedges soaked in water, which would swell and help crack stone along desired lines, along with copper and bronze tools for finer shaping work, since the Inca did work with bronze, even without iron or steel. Moving the finished blocks likely involved teams of workers using ropes, wooden rollers, and earthen ramps built up alongside the stone as it was gradually maneuvered into position, a laborious process of small, coordinated movements rather than any single dramatic feat of engineering. Imagine dozens of workers, chanting in rhythm perhaps, as many traditional cultures do to coordinate heavy lifting, inching a stone block that might weigh several tons up a temporary earthen ramp, one careful pull at a time, over the course of days or even weeks for the largest blocks. And then once in position, master stonemasons, likely a smaller specialized group distinct from the general Mita laborers who did the quarrying and hauling, would do the fine work of shaping each block's edges to fit precisely against its neighbors, testing the fit repeatedly, removing the block, shaving away a fraction more stone, replacing it, testing again. In a process that could take considerable time for a single joint, but that produced walls capable of surviving earthquakes that would topple more rigid mortar-based construction. This is not incidental. The region sits along a seismically active zone, and the slightly flexible, interlocking nature of Inca ashlar walls allowed them to shift very slightly during tremors and then settle back into place, rather than cracking and collapsing the way a rigid mortared wall might. Centuries later, this same engineering principle would help these walls survive largely intact through earthquakes that damaged Spanish colonial buildings constructed nearby using European techniques. I find something quietly moving in this detail. The precision we marvel at today, the seamless stonework that draws visitors from around the world, was not decoration. It was function. It was thousands of hours of anonymous labor solving a real engineering problem in a landscape that regularly tested the durability of anything built upon it. Not every structure at Machu Picchu received this level of refined stonework, of course. The most elaborate ashlar construction was reserved for temples, royal residences, and other high-status buildings. Ordinary residential structures, where the estate's permanent staff and workers actually lived day to day, were built using a rougher technique, fieldstones held together with mud mortar, still skillfully constructed, still built to last, but requiring far less specialized labor and time than the polished stonework of the religious district. This distinction in construction quality tells us something important about how the site was organized socially, a hierarchy written directly into the architecture itself. And that brings us to a question worth sitting with for a while tonight. Who actually lived here once the construction was finished? Let's go find out. Who actually lived here? Modern archaeological estimates suggest that Machu Picchu, at its height, was home to somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people on a permanent, year-round basis, though that number likely swelled during certain religious festivals or during visits from the emperor and his larger retinue, when the resident population might have temporarily hosted several hundred additional visitors, attendants, and nobles. This is worth pausing on because it immediately tells us this was not simply a lonely retreat where an emperor went to be alone with his thoughts. It was closer to a small, self-sufficient town, complete with its own social hierarchy, its own economy of labor and resources, and its own daily rhythms of work and rest. At the top of this hierarchy sat the emperor himself, though Pachacuti and his immediate successors would not have lived here full-time. Cusco remained the political capital of the empire, and an emperor's duties required his presence there for much of the year. Machu Picchu functioned more as a seasonal retreat, a place the emperor and his close family and attendants would travel to periodically, particularly it seems during certain religious observances tied to the solar calendar, since several structures at the site appear deliberately aligned with solstice sunrises and sunsets. Below the emperor, when he was in residence, was a class of religious and administrative elites, likely including priests dedicated to the worship of Inti, the sun god, along with a group of women known as the Aklakuna, sometimes translated as chosen women, who lived in a dedicated residential compound at the site and were responsible for weaving fine textiles, brewing chicha, a fermented corn beverage central to Inca religious and social life, and performing various ceremonial duties. These women were selected, often as young girls, from communities throughout the empire based on beauty, skill, or family status, and their lives, while materially comfortable compared to ordinary peasants, were also highly restricted and dedicated entirely to religious and state service rather than to their own families or personal choices, a detail worth sitting with honestly rather than romanticizing, since it reflects a system that, for all its engineering brilliance, still asked enormous personal sacrifice of specific people, often without much say in the matter. Then there was the permanent working population, the group we are actually most interested in tonight, since these were the ordinary people whose daily lives most closely resemble the kind of everyday history this channel is built around. This group included farmers who worked the estate's agricultural terraces, herders who managed llama and alpaca flocks, stonemasons and general laborers who maintained and continued to expand the site's construction even after its initial building phase, cooks, servants, and a range of specialized craftspeople, potters, weavers, and metal workers, who produced the goods needed to sustain daily life on the mountain. Interestingly, archaeological evidence, particularly analysis of skeletal remains found in burial sites around Machu Picchu, suggests this permanent working population was remarkably diverse, drawn from various regions across the growing Inca Empire, rather than being a single local ethnic group. This fits with what we know of broader Inca administrative practice. The empire frequently relocated entire communities, a policy called mitmakuna, moving loyal populations into newly conquered territories to help stabilize them, and moving people from newly conquered regions into more established areas of the empire, partly to break up potential resistance and partly to spread specialized skills and knowledge throughout Inca territory. It is entirely plausible that at least some of Machu Picchu's permanent residents arrived there not by personal choice, but as part of this broader system of managed relocation, bringing with them the customs, techniques, and even the accents of distant regions of the empire, and gradually building a new blended community life on this particular mountain. I want you to imagine what that might have actually felt like, arriving as a young man or woman, perhaps with your family, perhaps alone, having been told by imperial officials that your household's obligation this year, or perhaps permanently, would be fulfilled at a mountain estate several weeks' travel from wherever your own ancestors had lived. You arrived to find a community already partly established, other families from other regions, their own dialects, their own small variations in how they prepared food or wore their hair, or told their stories around the evening fire. Over months and years, these differences would have softened, blended, formed into the particular local culture of this one mountain community, distinct from Cusco, distinct from wherever any individual family had originally come from, its own small world perched between two peaks above a river valley. This is one of the things I find most quietly remarkable about Machu Picchu, once you look past the postcard image of dramatic ruins against a mountain backdrop. It was, in its own way, a genuinely cosmopolitan little society, built by hands from all across a vast empire, sustaining itself through careful agriculture and craft, existing largely independent of the wider political drama happening back in Cusco, at least on any given ordinary morning. Let's spend some time inside one of those ordinary mornings now. Let's go inside. A morning on the mountain, let's imagine this for a moment. It is sometime around the year 1470, on the mountain we now call Machu Picchu, though the people living there most likely had a different name for it, one lost to us now, since the name we use today was simply what nearby Quechua-speaking communities called the surrounding peak centuries later, when Bingham's expedition arrived and asked local guides what the mountain was called. It is early morning. The sun has not yet cleared the eastern ridge, though the sky above the peaks has already turned that particular pale gray-blue that comes just before real light. The air is cold, the kind of high-altitude cold that has weight to it, that you can feel settling into your shoulders even under a heavy woven poncho. Somewhere below the terraces, mist is still pooling in the river valley, thick and white, hiding the Urubamba entirely from view, though you know it is down there, because you can hear it, a low, constant rushing sound carried up on the morning air. A woman is waking inside a small stone house near the edge of one of the residential terraces. The house has no windows in the way we would picture them, just a single low doorway, trapezoidal in shape, narrower at the top than at the bottom, a distinctive Inca architectural feature that, as it happens, also helped these structures withstand earthquakes better than a rectangular doorway would. The roof is thatched, a tightly woven layer of local grass called iku, angled steeply to shed the frequent mountain rain, and even before she opens her eyes, she can hear that rain has fallen overnight, a soft dripping still coming from the eaves. She rises from a sleeping mat laid on a raised stone platform along one wall, still wrapped in a woven blanket, and her bare feet meet a floor of packed earth, cool but not unpleasantly so. In the corner of the small room, the previous evening's cooking fire has burned down to embers, still faintly glowing beneath a bed of ash, and she kneels beside it now, feeding in small dry twigs first, then slightly larger pieces, coaxing the embers back into flame with a patience that comes from having done this exact task every single morning of her adult life. Smoke begins to curl upward, most of it finding its way out through gaps near the roofline, though enough lingers in the room that the whole space carries a permanent, not unpleasant smell of wood smoke, one that would have clung to clothing, hair, and skin as a simple, constant fact of daily existence. Outside, other households are stirring in similar fashion, and the mountain slowly fills with the small sounds of a community waking, someone coughing. A dog of a small domesticated breed the Inca kept, barking once at nothing in particular. The dull, rhythmic sound of a stone grinding tool being used somewhere nearby, a woman crushing dried corn kernels into flour for the morning meal, using a technique involving a flat grinding stone called a batten and a smaller handheld stone called a mano, a method of food preparation essentially unchanged across thousands of years of Andean history and in some remote communities, still practiced in similar form today. I want you to imagine the woman's breakfast preparation itself, since it tells us a great deal about ordinary Inca food culture, which was, in truth, remarkably sophisticated given the challenging high-altitude environment these communities had learned to master over centuries. The core of most meals was some combination of maize, potatoes, and quinoa, three crops that between them could be grown successfully across the varied microclimates of Andean terracing, since different terrace levels at Machu Picchu and across the empire generally offered slightly different temperatures and soil conditions suited to different crops. Maize held particular cultural and religious significance beyond its nutritional value, since it was used to brew chicha, the fermented corn beverage central to religious ceremony, social gatherings, and, quite simply, daily hydration and calories in a culture that did not have easy access to the kind of varied beverages we take for granted today. Potatoes, of which the Inca cultivated an extraordinary number of distinct varieties. Some estimates suggest several thousand types across the wider Andean region, were often processed into a freeze-dried product called chuño, created through a labor-intensive process of alternating freezing during cold mountain nights with pressing out moisture during the day over several days, resulting in a lightweight, long-lasting food that could be stored for years without spoiling. A critical technology in a region where crop failure in any single season could otherwise mean disaster. Our woman this particular morning is likely preparing a simple porridge, ground maize, or rehydrated chuño simmered with water over the fire, perhaps flavored with herbs gathered from nearby slopes, or on a good day with a small amount of dried meat, since the Inca kept llamas both for wool and on occasion for meat, along with guinea pigs called kai, which were raised inside many households specifically for food, and were considered an important, accessible source of protein. Often kept living in the corner of the very same kitchen space, moving freely around the floor and living off scraps until it was time for one to become part of a meal, a practice that persists in parts of the Andes to this very day. Her husband, meanwhile, has already stepped outside, pulling his poncho tighter against the cold morning air, to check on the household's small flock of guinea pigs and to begin the walk toward the terraces where he will spend most of his day. Depending on the season, his work might involve planting, weeding, harvesting, or maintaining the elaborate irrigation channels that carried water down from mountain springs through a carefully engineered system of stone-lined canals, distributing water evenly across dozens of individual terrace levels, a system so effective that modern engineers who have studied it consistently express genuine admiration for its design, since it prevented both flooding during heavy rains and drought during dry spells. Through careful gradient calculations and drainage layers built beneath the growing soil of each terrace, layers of stone, gravel, sand, and topsoil, in that specific order, that also helped prevent erosion on what would otherwise be dangerously steep mountain slopes. As the sun finally begins to clear the eastern peaks, its light does something remarkable to this landscape, something the original builders very likely designed for deliberately. Certain terraces and structures catch the first direct sunlight in ways that seem intentional, and several key buildings, including what modern archaeologists call the Temple of the Sun, a curved stone structure with a trapezoidal window, appear specifically oriented to catch sunlight in particular patterns during the June solstice, when the sun in the southern hemisphere reaches its northernmost point and days are shortest. An event of enormous religious significance in a culture whose entire understanding of agricultural timing and whose central religious devotion revolved around the sun. Our imagined household, though, is not thinking about solstice alignments this particular morning. They are thinking about breakfast, about the day's work ahead, about whether the morning fog will burn off before midday or linger, and make the terraced paths slick and dangerous underfoot. Their concerns, in other words, are the same small, practical concerns that have occupied ordinary working households across nearly every culture in human history. Food, weather, work, family, the particular texture of an individual life, largely unconcerned with the empire-spanning ambitions of the emperor who, several days' journey away in Cusco, may or may not even be thinking about this particular mountain estate on this particular morning. Let's follow the woman as she finishes preparing the meal, and let's step further into the daily rhythms of this community, because there is quite a lot more worth seeing here. The terraces and the water that made them work. I want you to really imagine the scale of the agricultural terracing at this site, because it is one of those details that tends to get glossed over in favor of the more photogenic temple ruins, even though it likely represents the single largest engineering achievement on the entire mountain. Machu Picchu contains something in the range of 600 individual terraces, cut into the mountainside across roughly the entire visible slope of the site. Each one had to be individually engineered, not simply carved flat, since a flat terrace with ordinary soil would erode rapidly under the heavy seasonal rains common to this region. Instead, each terrace was built up in careful layers, starting with a base of larger stones for drainage, then a layer of smaller gravel above that, then coarser sand, and only at the very top, a layer of fertile topsoil, often transported from lower, richer valley locations specifically for this purpose, since the native mountain soil at this elevation was often too poor or rocky to support good crop yields on its own. Think about what that means practically. Someone, or rather thousands of someones, over the course of the estate's construction and ongoing maintenance, had to identify good topsoil elsewhere, likely down in the valley near the river, dig it out, and carry it, basket by basket, up steep mountain trails, to be spread across terrace after terrace after terrace. This is not a task that gets much attention in most retellings of Machu Picchu's story, and yet it likely represents more raw physical labor than the more celebrated stonework of the temples. The terraces served a second purpose beyond simple food production, one that modern engineers have come to appreciate more fully in recent decades. They stabilized the entire mountainside against landslides, which are a serious and constant risk in this steep, wet, seismically active region. The retaining walls of each terrace, combined with the internal drainage layers, effectively distributed the weight and water flow of the mountain in a controlled way, preventing the kind of catastrophic slope failure that has, in fact, damaged or destroyed other ancient sites in similar terrain. In a very real sense, the terraces were not just farmland. They were the structural foundation that has allowed the more famous temples and residences above them to survive largely intact for over 5 centuries. Now let's talk about water, since a system of terraces this extensive would be useless without a way to distribute water evenly and reliably across it. The site's builders identified natural springs higher up the mountain and channeled their flow down through an intricate network of stone-cut canals, some running along the surface, some running beneath pathways and through specially constructed conduits, delivering water first to the most important structures, likely including any residence used by the emperor during his visits, before continuing downward to serve the agricultural terraces and residential areas below. One particular feature, sometimes called the fountain system by modern researchers, consists of a sequence of 16 small stone fountains, each one positioned slightly lower than the last, so that water flows continuously downward from one to the next in a carefully engineered cascade. Imagine a woman filling a ceramic water jug at one of these fountains in the early morning, the sound of water trickling steadily over stone, cold to the touch even in the warmer months, this water having traveled down from a mountain spring through a system designed centuries earlier by people whose names we will never know, engineers whose expertise was passed down through practical apprenticeship rather than written manuals, since again, the Inca kept no written technical documents in the way later cultures would. The overall effect of this water system was to make the entire site remarkably self-sufficient. Combined with the agricultural output of the terraces, the site's residents likely did not need to import large quantities of food or water from outside, at least not for basic subsistence, though certain goods, particular textiles, ceremonial items, and specific foods favored by elite visitors, likely still arrived via the network of roads and trails connecting Machu Picchu to the wider Inca road system, a system so extensive that at its height, the empire maintained something in the range of 25,000 miles of interconnected roads and trails across its territory, an infrastructure achievement that, again, rarely receives the attention it deserves compared to the more visually striking stone architecture that infrastructure ultimately supported. Let's pause here for a moment, since I think this is worth sitting with quietly before we move on. So much of what makes Machu Picchu feel almost magical to modern visitors, its impossible mountaintop setting, its precise stonework, its quiet, contemplative atmosphere, was actually the product of extremely practical engineering problem solving. Water management, soil stability, erosion control. It's the kind of unglamorous, essential infrastructure work that, in almost every human civilization throughout history, tends to go unnamed and unrecorded, even though it is very often the thing that makes everything else possible. Somewhere on this mountain, right now, in our imagined scene from around 1470, a young apprentice stonemason is probably standing beside an older, more experienced worker, learning exactly how deep to dig a drainage channel, exactly how to angle a terrace wall so it will hold against the next heavy rain. Neither of them, most likely, imagined that their careful, patient work would still be standing, largely unchanged, more than 500 years later, studied by engineers from entirely different continents who would marvel at how well it had all held together. Let's go inside one of the households again and talk about the clothing people wore and the extraordinary weaving tradition that made it, because textiles mattered here in ways that might surprise you. A cloth, thread, and the work of women's hands in many ways. Textiles mattered more to Inca society than gold did, which tends to surprise people, since our modern imagination of Inca wealth is so heavily shaped by Spanish accounts of golden temples and looted treasure. But gold, to the Inca, held primarily religious and decorative significance, associated with the sun god Inti. Cloth, on the other hand, was deeply woven, if you will forgive the pun, into nearly every important social, political, and religious transaction in Inca life. Fine textiles were given as gifts to seal political alliances. They were burned as offerings during religious ceremonies. They were used to pay respect to nobility and to the dead. An emperor might reward a loyal official not with coin, since none existed, but with a length of exceptionally fine cloth, an honor that carried enormous social weight. Understanding this helps explain why the production of textiles at a site like Machu Picchu was not treated as a minor domestic chore, but as skilled, valued, and in some cases highly prestigious labor. Let's imagine, for a moment, one of the women living in the compound reserved for the Eclacuna, the chosen women we mentioned earlier, whose responsibilities included weaving some of the empire's finest cloth. Picture her seated on the floor of a workroom, legs extended in front of her, a backstrap loom tied at one end to a post or wall anchor, and at the other end around her own waist, so that her body itself provides the tension needed to weave. This technique, called backstrap weaving, is still practiced today by indigenous weavers throughout the Andes, largely unchanged in its basic mechanics across many centuries. In front of her, the beginnings of a pattern are already taking shape, geometric bands of color, deep reds derived from cochineal, a dye made from crushed insects that live on prickly pear cacti, warm yellows from various plant sources, and deep, rich purples and blues achieved through careful, time-consuming dyeing processes that Inca textile workers had refined over generations. The fiber itself is likely alpaca wool for a piece of this quality, softer and finer than the coarser llama wool used for more everyday, utilitarian cloth, though the very finest textiles, called kumbai, might incorporate vicuña wool, from a wild, undomesticated relative of the llama and alpaca, whose fiber is so fine and so difficult to obtain, since vicuña cannot easily be herded or sheared in the same way. That kumbai cloth was reserved almost exclusively for the emperor and the highest nobility. The weaving itself required extraordinary patience and skill. A single fine textile might take weeks or months to complete, with intricate patterns requiring the weaver to track dozens of individual thread counts simultaneously, entirely from memory and practiced hand movement, since again, there was no written pattern to follow in the way a modern knitter might use a printed chart. This knowledge passed from mother to daughter, generation after generation, an oral and physical tradition of mathematical and artistic sophistication that modern textile historians have come to respect enormously, some noting that certain traditional Andean weaving patterns encode information nearly as complex as some early forms of written record keeping. I want you to imagine the sound of this work, since it is a detail easy to overlook. The soft, rhythmic thump of a weaving batten being pressed against newly woven thread to pack it tightly into place. The quiet murmur of conversation between women working side by side, since weaving, though demanding intense concentration, was also frequently a social activity, done in groups. Stories and gossip and songs passed back and forth across the workroom as hands kept moving. Outside, perhaps, children too young yet to weave themselves playing nearby, watched over loosely while their mothers worked, learning simply by observing, the way most skills in this society were learned, through years of quiet proximity to someone already skilled, long before any formal instruction ever began. And clothing itself, for both men and women across all levels of this society, followed relatively consistent basic forms, though quality of material and complexity of decoration varied enormously based on social status. Men typically wore a simple tunic called an unku, a rectangular garment with holes for the head and arms, belted at the waist, along with a larger cloak or mantle for warmth, fastened with a decorative pin called a tupu. Women wore a long wrapped garment called an anaku, essentially a large rectangle of cloth wrapped around the body and pinned at the shoulders, again with a tupu, along with a shawl called a likla worn over the shoulders and often used, quite practically, to carry infants or small loads on the back, a practice that, again, persists in very similar form among indigenous Andean women today. For someone working the terraces or performing physical labor at this altitude, clothing needed to manage a genuinely challenging climate, warm sun during the day at times, but rapid, sharp drops in temperature the moment clouds rolled in or the sun set, combined with frequent rain. Layering was essential, and the insulating properties of alpaca and llama wool, which trap air efficiently and retain warmth even when slightly damp, made Andean textile technology remarkably well suited to exactly this kind of environment, refined over many centuries of living and working in these exact conditions. Let's step outside again for a moment, into the small plazas and pathways of the site, and think about how children actually grew up in a place like this, since childhood here, as in most historical societies, looked quite different from what we might expect. Childhood on the mountain, imagine a small child, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, following just behind his mother as she walks along one of the narrow stone paths connecting the residential terraces to the central plaza area. He is barefoot or perhaps wearing simple woven sandals, and he moves carefully, since he has already learned, likely through a scraped knee or two, that these paths and the steep drop-offs beside them demand respect even from small children who have grown up around them their whole lives. And childhood in Inca society, as in most pre-industrial societies around the world, did not involve a long, protected period of pure play separate from productive work, the way modern Western childhood is often structured. Very young children were given considerable freedom to play, and Spanish colonial accounts, along with broader Andean ethnographic evidence, suggest Inca parents were generally regarded as warm and affectionate, without the harsh corporal discipline that characterized child rearing in many contemporary European societies of the same era. But from a fairly early age, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, children began to take on real, meaningful work responsibilities, gradually increasing as they grew. So a young girl of 6 or 7 might be given responsibility for watching over the household's guinea pigs, making sure they had food and water and did not wander off, or for minding a younger sibling while her mother worked at the loom or prepared food. The boy of similar age might accompany his father to the terraces, not doing heavy labor yet, but learning by watching, perhaps fetching water, perhaps helping scare birds away from ripening crops, a genuinely useful task that required no great strength, only attentiveness and a willingness to spend long hours outdoors. By age 10 or 12, children were expected to contribute substantially to household labor. Girls were learning to spin thread, an essential precursor skill to weaving that took considerable practice to do well, using a simple drop spindle. A weighted stick that, once mastered, allowed a skilled spinner to produce thread almost automatically while walking, talking, or watching over younger children simultaneously, a kind of productive multitasking built directly into the technology itself. Boys were learning agricultural techniques in earnest, along with, depending on family specialization, skills like stonework, pottery, or herding. There is a particularly interesting piece of evidence about Inca childhood that comes from a source most people do not immediately associate with everyday domestic life: the practice of Pachacuti, a religious ritual involving the ceremonial sacrifice of children, typically selected for their beauty, health, or family status, offered during times of significant crisis or major imperial events, such as the death of an emperor or a severe drought. This is a difficult and somber piece of the historical record, and I want to be honest with you about it rather than simply skip past it, since pretending this practice did not exist would not serve the full, real picture of this society we are trying to build together tonight. Frozen mummified remains of several such children have been discovered at high-altitude sites across the Andes, remarkably well preserved by the extreme cold, and they have given researchers an extraordinarily detailed, if somber, window into aspects of Inca childhood, including the clothing children wore, the food they ate in their final days, which chemical analysis suggests was notably richer and more varied than an ordinary child's diet, likely reflecting their elevated ceremonial status in the period leading up to their selection, and even, through hair analysis measuring chemical changes over time, evidence suggesting some of these children were given substances to ease anxiety or induce calm in their final hours. There is no direct evidence that Pachacuti ceremonies took place at Machu Picchu specifically, and I do not want to suggest otherwise. But this practice existed within the same broader Inca religious framework that shaped daily life at this site, a framework where children, like adults, were understood as active participants in an ongoing relationship between human communities and powerful, demanding, and not always benevolent divine forces. A spiritual worldview quite different from many modern assumptions about childhood as a protected, sheltered category of life, separate entirely from serious religious and civic obligation. For most children living at Machu Picchu on any ordinary day, though, life likely centered on far gentler rhythms, learning songs from grandparents in the evening by the fire, helping gather herbs on the lower slopes, playing simple games, some involving small stones or carved figures that archaeologists have found at various Inca sites, games whose exact rules are now lost to us, but whose basic form, small objects manipulated according to some agreed set of rules, suggests something not entirely unlike games children still play today, across cultures and centuries. A small, quiet reminder that some things about being young and human do not change nearly as much as the larger structures of politics, religion, and empire around them. Let's move now toward the more solemn, ceremonial side of this community's life, since religion here was not a separate category from daily existence the way it can sometimes feel in modern life. It was woven through nearly everything, including, as we will see, the very design of the buildings themselves. The sun, the stone, and the quiet work of faith. Let's go inside the religious heart of this community now, since faith here was not something practiced only inside a temple building on special occasions. It ran through the whole rhythm of the day, the planting season, the changing angle of sunlight against a familiar wall. At the highest point of the developed site sits a carved stone outcropping known today as the Intihuatana, a name given to it in modern times that translates roughly to hitching post of the sun. The stone itself is not large, a naturally occurring granite outcrop that Inca stonemasons carved and shaped into a series of angular planes and a small central protrusion, aligned with remarkable precision to the surrounding mountain peaks and to the movement of the sun throughout the year. Imagine a priest standing beside this stone on the morning of the June solstice, the shortest day of the year in the southern hemisphere, waiting in the cold pre-dawn air as a small gathering of community members stands respectfully nearby. As the sun clears the eastern ridge, its light strikes the stone at a specific angle that Inca astronomers, through careful long-term observation passed down across generations, had determined marked this particular, religiously significant moment in the solar year. The priest performs a ritual, likely involving offerings of chicha, coca leaves, or small food items, poured or placed directly onto the stone or the ground around it, a gesture of reciprocity, of giving something back to the sun in gratitude for its continued life-sustaining presence, and perhaps as a kind of insurance, a plea that the sun continue its journey northward again, rather than continuing to recede and plunge the world into ever shorter, ever colder days. This idea of reciprocity is worth pausing on, since it sits at the very center of how Inca religious thought approached the natural world. The Quechua concept of Aini, meaning mutual exchange or reciprocal obligation, governed not only relationships between individual community members, who were expected to help one another with major tasks like house building or harvest, with the understanding that this help would be returned in kind when needed, but also the relationship between human communities and the natural and spiritual world around them. The earth, personified as Pachamama, was owed regular small offerings in exchange for the fertility she provided. The mountains themselves, called Apis, were considered powerful spiritual beings in their own right, capable of protecting or harming the communities living on their slopes, and worthy of regular respect and offering. This helps explain something about the choice of location for Machu Picchu that goes beyond simple practical or aesthetic considerations. The site sits surrounded by several particularly prominent, dramatic peaks, and it is quite likely that these mountains themselves, understood as powerful apis, were part of why this specific location was chosen for such an important royal and religious estate, a place where the emperor, considered a direct descendant of the sun god, could exist in close physical and spiritual proximity to some of the most powerful mountain spirits in the entire region. Beyond the Intihuatana, several other structures at the site carried significant religious weight. The Temple of the Sun, which we mentioned briefly earlier, is a curved, exceptionally finely built structure containing a trapezoidal window aligned to catch direct sunlight on the June solstice morning, illuminating an interior stone platform in a way that was almost certainly designed deliberately, since the precision required to achieve this effect rules out coincidence. Beneath this temple sits a carved rock chamber that some archaeologists believe may have functioned as a royal mausoleum, possibly intended to house the mummified remains of Pachacuti himself after his death, since Inca emperors, unlike ordinary people, were not simply buried and left. Their mummified bodies were preserved, dressed in fine clothing, and continued to be treated, in a very real practical sense, as active, ongoing participants in imperial governance and ceremony, brought out for important festivals, consulted symbolically on major decisions, and maintained by dedicated attendants for generations after their biological death. I find this practice, once you sit with it a while, genuinely fascinating, since it reflects an entirely different cultural relationship with death and continuity than most of us grow up assuming is simply universal. An Inca emperor's authority did not necessarily end with his physical death. His mummy, his estates, his household staff, and his descendants together formed something called a panaca, a royal lineage group that continued to manage his property, honor his memory through ongoing ritual, and in some cases wield real political influence long after the emperor himself had died, since a new emperor was expected, upon taking the throne, to build and endow his own new estates and property rather than simply inheriting his predecessors, a system that, some historians argue, may have been part of what drove the constant, restless expansion of the Inca Empire in the first place. Each new emperor needed to conquer new territory and build new monuments specifically because his predecessor's considerable estate, including quite possibly a mountain retreat much like Machu Picchu, remained the permanent property of that predecessor's own ongoing royal household, even after death. If this theory holds, and many respected archaeologists find it persuasive, it means Machu Picchu itself may have continued functioning, for some time after Pachacuti's death, as a site dedicated specifically to maintaining his memory and mummified remains, tended by a household of priests, attendants, and support staff whose entire purpose revolved around honoring a ruler who had died possibly decades earlier. A strange and quietly moving thought, this mountain community organizing its daily labor, its agriculture, its religious calendar, around the ongoing care of someone who was, in the most literal sense, already gone. Let's step back down from the temples now, into the more ordinary spaces of daily worship and small household ritual, since religion here was not only grand solar ceremony. It was also small, quiet, and personal. Small gods and evening fires I want you to imagine. Now, an ordinary evening rather than a grand solstice ceremony, since most religious practice in a place like this was quiet, small, and woven into daily habit rather than reserved for major festivals. A family is finishing their evening meal, seated around the low fire inside their home as darkness settles fully over the mountain and the temperature drops sharply, the way it does at this altitude once the sun disappears. Before eating, the mother has already, almost without thinking about it, flicked a small portion of chicha onto the ground near the doorway, a brief, automatic gesture of offering to Pachamama, the earth, thanking her for the meal about to be consumed, a habit so deeply ingrained that it required no real conscious thought. Similar in its unconscious repetition to how many people today might say a quick word of thanks before a meal, without dwelling deeply on the theological meaning behind it in that particular moment. Small household shrines, often little more than a specific stone, a small niche in a wall, or a particular natural feature nearby considered to hold spiritual significance, called huacas, were common throughout Inca society, and it is likely that certain locations around Machu Picchu, perhaps a particular rock formation, a spring, or a cave, held this kind of localized sacred meaning for the community living there. Sites that might not appear especially significant to a modern visitor walking past them today, but that would have carried real weight to the people who lived alongside them daily, places you did not disturb carelessly, places you paused near, even briefly, out of simple respect learned from childhood. The coca leaf played a significant, everyday role in this religious and social fabric as well. Chewed regularly by adults, particularly those doing strenuous physical labor at high altitude, coca leaves helped combat fatigue and the effects of thin mountain air, effects modern science associates with altitude and reduced oxygen availability, though the Inca themselves would have understood coca's benefits through direct practical experience and cultural tradition rather than modern physiological explanation. Coca leaves were also used constantly in religious offerings, thrown onto sacred fires, left at huacas, and used in a common form of everyday divination, where a person, often a specialist called a diviner, but sometimes simply an experienced elder, would read patterns in how scattered coca leaves fell to answer questions or seek guidance about upcoming decisions, weather, or health concerns. A practice that has continued in various forms in parts of the Andes into the present day. I want you to imagine in this same evening scene an elderly member of the household, perhaps a grandmother, sitting slightly apart from the fire, chewing coca leaves slowly while she works a small hand spindle, spinning thread almost automatically, decades of practiced habit in every movement of her hands, while younger children sit near her feet, listening as she tells a story, perhaps about the founding of the Inca people themselves. A story involving the god Viracocha and the first Inca emerging from the depths of Lake Titicaca, or perhaps a smaller, more local story about the particular mountain apis surrounding their own home, stories that carried both entertainment and quiet moral instruction. Since in a society without written language, oral storytelling served as the primary method for passing down not just religious belief but practical knowledge, family history, and social values from one generation to the next. Outside, the night sky above the Andes, largely free of the light pollution that obscures stars for most people today, would have been extraordinarily vivid, and Inca astronomy, though different in its framework from later Western scientific astronomy, was sophisticated and carefully observed. Beyond individual stars and constellations recognized in familiar shapes, similar to how many cultures have identified patterns among stars, Inca skywatchers also paid close attention to dark shapes formed by the absence of stars against the bright background of the Milky Way, identifying figures like a llama, a fox, and a toad within these darker patches, a genuinely distinctive way of reading the night sky that reflects careful, patient, generational observation of a landscape most modern city dwellers rarely get to see with such clarity anymore. There is something worth sitting with quietly here before we move forward. This household, going about an entirely unremarkable evening, chewing coca, telling old stories, making small offerings almost without conscious thought, was not separate from the grand solar ceremonies and royal ambitions we discussed a moment ago. It was the same fabric, simply at a different scale. The emperor's alignment with the sun and the grandmother's quiet story about a mountain spirit were part of one continuous, coherent way of understanding the world, one where the sacred and the ordinary were never really considered separate categories in the first place. Let's leave this quiet evening now and turn toward a different kind of evening gathering, the communal meal, since food and shared eating held its own particular social importance in this community, one worth spending some time on before we move toward the later, harder chapters of this story. Chicha, FASTS, and the bonds of shared work. Let's imagine a different kind of day now, not an ordinary Tuesday, so to speak, but a day of communal labor, since much of the hardest agricultural and construction work at Machu Picchu, as throughout the Inca Empire generally, was organized not simply as individual household toil, but as large-scale cooperative effort, and these efforts were customarily accompanied by feasting and, most importantly, by generous quantities of chicha. Chicha, the fermented maize beverage we have mentioned a few times already, deserves a fuller picture, since it was genuinely central to the social and economic functioning of this entire civilization, in a way that might be hard to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point where alcohol, for many people, occupies a fairly narrow, mostly recreational role. Producing chicha was a labor-intensive process, typically undertaken by women, involving grinding maize, sometimes germinating it first to increase its sugar content through a malting process, cooking it into a thick liquid, and then, in one method that might surprise modern listeners, having the liquid chewed by workers, whose saliva contains enzymes that help break down starches into fermentable sugars, before being spat back into the fermentation vessel. It's a technique used in various forms across many pre-industrial cultures around the world for producing fermented beverages, and one that, however unusual it might sound to modern ears, was a perfectly ordinary, unremarkable part of daily food production to the people practicing it. Large ceramic vessels, some of them quite substantial in size, were used to store fermenting chicha, and archaeological evidence at Machu Picchu includes storage buildings, called calca, that likely held not only chicha but also large quantities of dried maize, chuño, and other preserved foods, insurance against poor harvests, and a resource that could be drawn upon during major communal feasts. Now imagine a day when the community has gathered to complete a major, labor-intensive task, perhaps clearing and preparing a new terrace, or perhaps helping with a significant repair to one of the water channels after a heavy rain has caused some damage. Dozens of workers, men and women both, though often organized into somewhat separate work groups by gender depending on the specific task, spend the day laboring together under the direction of an overseer, likely a local administrator answering, ultimately, to higher officials representing the emperor's interests. At the end of such a day, or sometimes at intervals throughout it, chicha would be distributed generously, along with a substantial shared meal, and this was not simply a reward tacked onto the end of the workday. It was an essential part of how the entire Mita labor system functioned socially and psychologically. The reciprocal exchange of labor for hospitality, embodied very literally in shared food and drink, reinforced the idea that labor given to the state was not simply extraction, but part of a broader relationship of mutual obligation between the community and the imperial authority they served, however much that relationship may have still involved real coercion and hierarchy beneath its surface of shared feasting and ceremony. Picture the scene itself. Workers tired from a full day of physical labor, sitting or standing in loose groups around the central plaza area as the light begins to fade and torches or fires are lit. Large ceramic jars of chicha being passed around, poured into individual drinking vessels, some plain and utilitarian, others, for those of higher status, finely decorated. Food being distributed, likely including roasted or stewed meat on such occasions, a relative luxury compared to the more modest daily diet of most ordinary workers, since meat, while not entirely absent from everyday meals, was more commonly reserved for these larger communal or ceremonial occasions. There would have been music as well, played on instruments including panpipes called antaras, made from hollow reeds bound together in graduated lengths to produce different pitches, along with various types of flutes and simple percussion instruments. Singing, likely including call and response patterns common in Andean musical tradition, would have accompanied the meal, along with dancing as the evening progressed, the specific steps and songs varying by region and occasion, but generally understood throughout Inca society as an important form of both entertainment and genuine religious or social expression. Dance and music rarely treated as purely secular entertainment, separate from spiritual meaning in the way modern audiences sometimes assume. I want you to sit for a moment with the emotional texture of an evening like this, since I think it says something important about how we should understand daily life in a society like this one. These were not simply passive laborers, extracted from and exploited by a distant, faceless imperial system. They were also, in these communal gatherings, genuinely enjoying themselves, forming friendships, courting potential spouses, singing songs their grandparents had sung, drinking chicha their neighbors had carefully prepared, under a night sky thick with stars on a mountain that, whatever else it was to the wider empire, was also simply their home. Let's turn now gently toward a harder chapter of this story, since no honest telling of Machu Picchu's history can avoid it. The world beyond these mountains was changing rapidly during this exact period, and the changes coming would eventually reach even this remote, carefully engineered mountain retreat, though perhaps more quietly than you might expect. A sickness that arrived before the soldiers did here is something that tends to surprise people when they first learn it, and I think it deserves to be told slowly, since it is one of the more quietly devastating aspects of this entire story. By the time Spanish conquistadors under Francisco Pizarro actually arrived in Inca territory in 1532, disease had already been moving through the empire for several years, likely having spread overland from earlier Spanish contact with other indigenous populations further north, in present-day Panama and Colombia, passing from community to community along the very same extensive road networks that had made the Inca Empire so administratively effective. Well before any Spaniard had personally set foot in Inca territory itself. Smallpox, a disease entirely unknown in the Americas before European contact, and one to which indigenous American populations had no immunity whatsoever, moved through the empire with catastrophic speed and mortality, killing, by many historians' estimates, somewhere between a third and half of the total population in the regions it swept through, figures almost too large to properly hold in the mind. Incomparable to, or in some estimates exceeding, the mortality rates of the Black Death in 14th century Europe, but compressed into a shorter, faster-moving wave of death across a population with no prior exposure at all to this particular pathogen. Among the dead, sometime around 1527, was the reigning Inca emperor himself, Huayna Capac, along with, according to several colonial-era accounts, his designated heir. This left the empire without a clear, uncontested successor at exactly the moment it could least afford instability, and it triggered a brutal civil war between two of Huayna Capac's surviving sons, Huascar and Atahualpa, a conflict that raged for roughly 5 years, weakening the empire's military strength, its administrative cohesion, and its capacity for unified resistance in the exact years immediately preceding Pizarro's arrival. I want you to imagine what this meant, practically, for a community like the one living at Machu Picchu during these years. News would have traveled to this mountain estate, likely with some delay given its relatively remote location, but travel it would have, along the same road networks and through the same administrative channels that connected every part of the empire. Word of the emperor's death. Word of disease spreading through distant provinces, killing family members some residents here may never have even met, since the empire's Mitmakuna relocation policies, discussed earlier, meant many people living at Machu Picchu likely had relatives scattered across considerable distances. Word, eventually, of two royal brothers fighting each other for control of an empire that, for the first time in generations, seemed genuinely unstable. Atahualpa eventually won this civil war, defeating and executing his brother Huascar, but this victory came at enormous cost, both in military resources and, crucially, in the empire's underlying unity, with many communities and regional leaders still nursing resentments and divided loyalties from the conflict when Pizarro's much smaller force arrived not long afterward. The famous encounter at Cajamarca in November 1532, where Pizarro's forces captured Atahualpa through treachery during what was meant to be a diplomatic meeting, and subsequently executed him despite receiving an enormous ransom in gold and silver paid for his release, is well documented in numerous histories, and we do not need to walk through every detail of it here tonight. What matters most for our particular story is what happened, or rather what largely did not happen, to Machu Picchu itself during and after this conquest. There is no solid historical or archaeological evidence that Spanish forces ever discovered or visited Machu Picchu during the conquest period or in the decades immediately following. This stands in sharp contrast to Cusco, the imperial capital, which the Spanish occupied, looted extensively and substantially rebuilt, constructing colonial churches and buildings directly atop the foundations of demolished Inca structures, in some cases literally using the same Inca stone blocks, expertly cut and readily available, as building material for new Spanish colonial construction. The detail some visitors to modern Cusco find quietly haunting when they notice the lower courses of certain colonial buildings are, in fact, original Inca stonework, still standing after everything built on top of it has changed entirely. Machu Picchu being a comparatively remote royal estate rather than a major population or administrative center, and lacking obvious mineral wealth that might have drawn Spanish attention, most likely simply fell outside the practical priorities of the conquest, at least in its early, most destructive phase. Some historians speculate that Spanish colonial administrators may have had some vague awareness of the site's existence, since certain colonial-era documents make passing reference to Inca settlements in the general region, but no detailed Spanish account of visiting this specific location has ever been found, suggesting that if the Spanish did know about it in any general sense, they never prioritized a direct visit, or crucially, never fully understood or documented what it actually was. So what happened to the community that had been living there? This is a question historians have had to approach carefully, since direct documentary evidence is scarce. The leading understanding, based on broader patterns of Inca society during this catastrophic period, is that Machu Picchu's population most likely declined gradually rather than being violently destroyed in any single dramatic event. As the wider imperial administrative and religious system that had originally supported and organized this royal estate collapsed, along with the death of successive emperors and the disintegration of the Pachacuti royal lineage system we discussed earlier. The practical, economic, and religious reasons for maintaining a full permanent population at this specific site would have weakened considerably. Some residents likely left for other communities, perhaps returning to ancestral homelands elsewhere in the empire, particularly among the Mitmakuna households, who may have felt reduced obligation to remain once central Inca administrative authority had fractured. Others may have died from the same disease epidemics sweeping through the wider region, since smallpox and subsequent waves of European disease continued to affect indigenous Andean populations for decades after initial contact, reaching even relatively remote communities through ongoing trade and travel networks. And still others, we can reasonably imagine, chose to remain for a time, farming the excellent terraces, tending what remained of the site before eventually, gradually, over one or perhaps two generations, the permanent population thinned to nothing at all, leaving behind stone structures that no longer had anyone specifically charged with their maintenance. Let's sit with that gradual, quiet ending for a moment, since I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets in popular retellings of this story, which often skips straight from thriving royal estate to dramatic 1911 rediscovery, as though nothing at all happened in the 4 centuries in between. 4 centuries of quiet. I want you to imagine, now, the long, slow passage of time across roughly 3.5 centuries, from sometime in the mid to late 1500s, when the last permanent residents most likely departed, until that wet July morning in 1911, when Hiram Bingham climbed up to see what remained. This is the part of the story where, frankly, very little happened, at least in terms of recorded human events, and yet I think it is worth spending time on anyway, since the sheer duration of this quiet is itself a remarkable thing to sit with. In the first years after the population thinned and eventually disappeared, the buildings would have remained largely intact, their stonework, as we discussed, engineered to withstand earthquakes and require little maintenance to remain structurally sound. But without residents to sweep courtyards, clear drainage channels, and maintain thatched roofs, which required periodic replacement as the iku grass aged and decayed, the ordinary processes of decay that any abandoned structure faces would have begun, slowly, patiently, working on the site. Thatched roofs, unmaintained, would have eventually collapsed or rotted away entirely, exposing interior spaces to weather for the first time in the building's history. Rainwater, no longer diverted by carefully maintained drainage systems, would have begun pooling in unexpected places, gradually undermining some structures while, curiously, leaving many others almost entirely unaffected, since the fundamental engineering of the site's water management and terracing was robust enough to continue functioning, at least partially, even without human maintenance. And vegetation in this humid, subtropical mountain environment would have moved in with remarkable speed. Within a few decades, certainly within a century, structures that had once stood in cleared, maintained plazas would have found themselves surrounded by encroaching jungle growth, vines climbing walls, small trees taking root in accumulated soil within courtyards, and even inside roofless buildings, grasses and shrubs gradually softening the sharp geometric lines of terraces that had once been meticulously maintained farmland. I want you to imagine what this site might have looked like at various points during this long silence, since it did not remain static. Perhaps around 1600, some structures still relatively clear, others already showing significant vegetation, the site perhaps still visited occasionally by local farming families from the surrounding region, using some of the more accessible terraces for their own small-scale agriculture, even without any permanent settlement remaining. Perhaps around 1750, considerably more overgrown, some structures partially collapsed, though the finest stonework, the temples and royal residence, likely still standing with much of their original form recognizable beneath accumulated vegetation. And by 1900, just over a decade before Bingham's arrival, a site substantially reclaimed by jungle growth, though, as we know from the historical record, not entirely unknown or unvisited, since local families were farming terraces there and had been for some years already. This detail is worth returning to one more time, since it genuinely challenges the popular narrative of Machu Picchu as a completely lost, forgotten city rediscovered against impossible odds. Local Quechua-speaking communities in this region maintained ongoing, if limited, awareness of and interaction with the site throughout this long period, likely including oral traditions about its origin and significance that, unfortunately, were never systematically recorded by outside researchers until well after 1911, and much of which, as a result, has likely been lost or altered by the time later ethnographers finally began asking questions about local knowledge and memory of the site. There is also reasonably solid documentary evidence that at least a few outside visitors, beyond purely local farming families, encountered the ruins before Bingham's famous 1911 visit, though none of these earlier encounters resulted in the kind of sustained academic attention and global publicity that followed Bingham's expedition. A German businessman named Augusto Burns, for instance, is documented to have known about ruins in this general area as early as the 1860s or 1880s, and some historical researchers have even suggested, based on old Peruvian government records, that Burns may have attempted some form of unauthorized excavation or treasure seeking at the site, potentially removing artifacts before Bingham's arrival. Though the precise details and extent of Burns' activities remain genuinely disputed among historians, and some of the underlying documentary evidence is fragmentary at best. Additionally, a British missionary named Thomas Paine and a few other individuals have been mentioned in various historical accounts and local records as having possibly visited or known about ruins in this region before 1911, along with references found carved or written on certain stones at the site itself, names and dates that predate Bingham's visit, suggesting at least a handful of outside visitors had made their way there over the preceding decades without ever publishing or widely sharing what they had seen. What made Bingham's visit different in the end was not that he was the first outsider to ever see these ruins. It was that he was the first to bring the full weight of an established academic institution, Yale University, combined with the enormous publicity machine of the National Geographic Society, to bear on documenting, photographing, and publicizing the site to a global audience. The April 1913 issue of National Geographic magazine devoted its entire contents, an unprecedented decision at the time, to Bingham's Machu Picchu discovery, filled with dramatic photographs of overgrown ruins and vivid descriptive prose. And this single publication is arguably what truly transformed a site locally known, but globally obscure, into one of the most recognized archaeological landmarks in the entire world. Let's go back one more time to that expedition itself and look more closely at what happened in the months and years immediately following that first wet July morning, since the story of how Machu Picchu became famous is, in its own way, just as interesting as the story of how it was originally built. From a single visit to a global sensation, Bingham's initial visit in July 1911 lasted only a few hours, enough time to explore the immediate area, take a handful of photographs with the equipment he had carried up that day, and make basic notes about what he had seen. He returned to the expedition's main camp that evening and, by most accounts, did not immediately grasp the full magnitude of what he had found, since he was still, at this point in the trip, primarily focused on his original goal of locating Vilcabamba, the last refuge of Inca resistance. It was only over the following months and years, as Bingham processed his notes and photographs back at Yale, and as he organized subsequent, far more thorough expeditions to the site in 1912 and 1915, this time with proper funding, professional archaeological support, and systematic excavation methods, that the true scale and significance of Machu Picchu began to come into focus, both for Bingham personally and for the wider academic and public audience he would eventually reach. The 1912 expedition, jointly funded again by Yale and the National Geographic Society, involved a much larger team, including trained archaeologists and engineers, and spent several months systematically clearing vegetation, mapping the site's layout in detail, and conducting excavations that uncovered burial sites, artifacts, and architectural features that had been entirely hidden beneath centuries of accumulated soil and plant growth during Bingham's brief initial visit the previous year. I want you to imagine the physical labor involved in this clearing process, since it was substantial and, in its own way, echoes the very same kind of hard manual work that had originally built the site centuries earlier, though now directed toward exposing rather than constructing. The teams of local Peruvian laborers, hired for the expedition, spent weeks cutting back thick vegetation, some of it involving trees that had grown to substantial size over the centuries and required considerable effort to remove without damaging the stonework beneath. Layer by layer, terrace by terrace, the site's original form gradually re-emerged, a process that must have felt, to those involved, something like watching an old photograph slowly develop, details sharpening and clarifying that had previously been only vague, overgrown shapes. This is also where a significant and, in later decades, quite controversial chapter of the story begins. During these expeditions, Bingham and his team removed a substantial quantity of artifacts from the site, including ceramics, metal objects, and human skeletal remains found in burial locations around the ruins, transporting them back to Yale University under an agreement with the Peruvian government that, depending on how you read the relevant documents, either permitted permanent removal or only a temporary loan for study purposes. A genuine ambiguity that would fuel decades of subsequent diplomatic and legal dispute between Peru and Yale. For nearly a century following these expeditions, these artifacts remained in Yale's possession, housed primarily at the Peabody Museum of Natural History, studied by generations of researchers, but also, increasingly, viewed by the Peruvian government and by many Peruvian citizens as improperly taken cultural patrimony that rightfully belonged in Peru, not in a university museum collection thousands of miles away in Connecticut. This dispute escalated over the decades into a formal, sometimes tense diplomatic and legal conflict, with the Peruvian government eventually filing a lawsuit against Yale in 2008 seeking the return of the collection. The dispute was eventually resolved, though it took considerable time and negotiation, through a series of agreements reached primarily between 2010 and 2012, under which Yale agreed to return the artifacts to Peru, a process that was completed with the final shipments arriving back in Peru around 2012, coinciding, somewhat poetically, with the 100th anniversary of Bingham's major 1912 expedition. The returned artifacts are now primarily housed and displayed at a museum in Cusco, specifically established for this collection, allowing Peruvian citizens and international visitors alike to view these objects in far closer proximity to their original context than had been possible during the preceding century. I raise this dispute not to cast simple villains and heroes onto this story, since the full history involves genuine complexity, differing legal interpretations of century-old agreements, and evolving international standards regarding cultural heritage and repatriation that did not exist in anything like their modern form back in 1912. But it is worth including in our telling tonight, since it reflects an important, ongoing conversation in the broader field of archaeology and museum practice about who has the right to hold, study, and display the physical remnants of a culture's past, particularly when that culture's descendants are still very much alive, still living in the same region, and still maintaining, in many cases, direct cultural and linguistic continuity with the people who built and inhabited sites like Machu Picchu centuries earlier. Beyond the artifact dispute, Machu Picchu's fame grew steadily throughout the 20th century, particularly following the widespread circulation of Bingham's National Geographic photographs and his subsequent popular books about the discovery, including a 1948 work titled Lost City of the Incas that helped cement, for a mass American and international readership, the somewhat exaggerated but enduringly popular framing of Machu Picchu as a completely lost, forgotten city, dramatically rediscovered by a single intrepid explorer, a framing that, as we have spent this whole evening exploring together, tells only part of a considerably richer and more complicated story. In 1981, Machu Picchu was designated a Peruvian historical sanctuary, and in 1983, it was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for both its outstanding cultural significance and its remarkable surrounding natural environment, since the designation actually covers both the archaeological ruins themselves and the surrounding cloud forest ecosystem, home to considerable biodiversity, including several rare and endangered species. In 2007, following a global online voting campaign, Machu Picchu was named one of the new 7 wonders of the world, cementing its place, alongside sites like the Great Wall of China and the Colosseum in Rome, among the handful of ancient constructions that have achieved truly global name recognition. Today, the site receives well over 1 million visitors annually, a figure that has raised genuine, ongoing concerns among archaeologists, conservationists, and the Peruvian government about sustainable tourism management, erosion, and the long-term preservation of stonework and terracing that, however remarkably well engineered, was never designed to withstand the foot traffic of modern mass tourism. Various measures, including timed entry tickets, mandatory guided tour along certain routes, and periodic discussions about visitor caps, have been implemented over the years in an effort to balance public access and appreciation against the practical need to preserve this extraordinary site for future generations. Let's slow down now and spend a little time simply reflecting on everything we have walked through together tonight before we let this particular fire burn down to embers. The stonemasons, one more time before we move toward reflection, I want to bring you back one more time to the stonemasons themselves, since I think there is a little more worth seeing there, a scene worth sitting inside a while longer. Let's go inside this scene together. It is midday, sometime in the 1460s, and the light is flat and even, the particular quality of light you get on a mountain when a thin layer of high cloud diffuses the sun without blocking it entirely. The master stonemason, a man probably in his 40s or 50s, old enough to have spent decades perfecting this trade, is crouched beside a partially set block of gray granite, running his fingertips slowly along a seam where this block meets its neighbor. He is not satisfied. There is the faintest gap, barely perceptible, somewhere along the lower edge, and he knows from long experience that a gap like this, however small it seems today, can become a real problem over years of seasonal freezing and thawing, water working its way in, expanding, gradually widening what starts as an imperceptible flaw. He gestures to two younger workers, apprentices perhaps, or simply junior laborers assigned to this section of wall, and together the three of them maneuver the block, using wooden levers and rope, easing it back out of position. The younger men look to him, and he studies the offending edge closely, running a rough stone abrasive along it in short, careful strokes, pausing every so often to blow away the resulting dust and check his progress with his fingers, feeling for the subtlest imperfection rather than relying on sight alone, since by feel he has told his apprentices more than once, you can catch things your eyes will miss. This process might repeat itself a dozen times for a single joint on a particularly important structure, the kind of patient, exacting repetition that produced the seamless stonework Machu Picchu remains famous for today. I want you to imagine the apprentices during this process, young men perhaps in their late teens or early 20s, watching closely, occasionally being handed the abrasive stone themselves, and allowed to try the next pass under the older mason's careful supervision, learning not through any written instruction manual, but through this same slow, hands-on apprenticeship that had, by this point in Inca history, it's already been refined across many generations of accumulated stoneworking tradition, inherited partly from earlier Andean cultures. There would have been conversation during this work, though likely quieter and more focused than the lively chatter of the weaving room, since this labor demanded closer concentration. Perhaps the older mason telling a story about a particularly difficult block he had once worked on years earlier, at a different site, under a different overseer, a story meant partly to entertain and partly, gently, to instruct, the way skilled tradespeople across many cultures and centuries have used storytelling to pass down both technical knowledge and professional pride to those learning under them. By the time the sun begins sinking toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the terraces below, this single joint might finally satisfy the master mason's exacting standards, and the block would be levered carefully back into its final position, tested once more with careful fingers, and left to settle. Multiply this single joint by the many thousands of similar joints across the site's finest stone structures, and you begin to appreciate the almost unimaginable quantity of patient, skilled, largely unrecorded labor that this mountain city represents, each stone fitted by particular hands belonging to particular people whose names, unfortunately, history has not preserved for us, but whose careful, exacting work has quite literally outlasted the empire that commissioned it by many centuries. Let's step forward again now, back toward 1911, and spend a little more time with the ordinary families who were living among these same ruins when Bingham finally arrived, since their story deserves more attention than it usually receives. The families who were already there, let's return, one final time, to that July morning in 1911, and give proper attention to the Richart and Alvarez families, since their part in this story tends to get compressed into a single passing sentence in most popular retellings, when in fact their presence at the site tells us something quite important. By the time Bingham arrived, these families had been farming terraces near the ruins for at least a couple of years, according to Bingham's own written accounts, having received permission from local landowners to cultivate this land, since even in 1911, all land in this region technically belonged to someone, some larger estate or hacienda, under the property arrangements of the era. The arrangements themselves rooted in centuries of colonial and post-colonial land tenure history that we do not have time to fully unpack tonight, but that meant even a remote mountain ruin site existed within somebody's recognized property boundaries. Imagine the daily life of these families in the months and years just before Bingham's arrival. A father clearing overgrown terraces, cutting back vegetation that had grown up over centuries, not out of any interest in archaeology, but simply because a cleared, sun-exposed terrace with rich, well-drained soil, built by ancient hands using techniques he likely recognized and respected as skilled, practical engineering, made an excellent place to grow corn and other crops for his own family's use. And children playing among the walls and structures, perhaps aware in some general sense that this was an old place, perhaps having absorbed some fragments of local oral tradition about it, without necessarily understanding, or particularly needing to understand, its full historical and religious significance to the vanished empire that had built it. When Bingham arrived, accounts suggest it was in fact one of these children, sometimes identified in various retellings as a boy from the Alvarez family, though the historical record on this specific detail is not entirely consistent across different accounts, who led him through the final overgrown stretch to see the most significant structures, since the family living there simply knew the site better than the visiting farmer Melchor Artiga did. Having spent considerably more time exploring and working around it, I want you to imagine this boy's perspective for a moment, since it offers a genuinely different vantage point on this whole story than the one we usually get, which centers almost entirely on Bingham's experience and expectations. To this child, these ruins were simply part of the landscape of his own childhood, unremarkable in the way that anything deeply familiar becomes unremarkable to the people who grow up surrounded by it. He had probably climbed these same walls dozens of times before, chased chickens or dogs through these same overgrown plazas, perhaps hidden from siblings during games among these same stone doorways. And now here was this tired, damp, oddly excited foreign visitor, asking endless questions through a translator, photographing walls this boy had walked past his whole life without a second thought, and treating the whole place with a kind of reverent astonishment that, to a child who had grown up here, might have seemed a little strange, even amusing. This detail matters, I think, because it captures something true about how significance and familiarity interact across history more broadly. What feels utterly ordinary, even unremarkable, to the people living inside a particular moment or place, can look entirely different, sometimes astonishing, to outsiders arriving later with different frameworks of expectation and value. This works in both directions across time as well. The stonemasons we imagined earlier, patiently perfecting a single stone joint, likely had no particular sense that their careful, ordinary daily labor was building something that visitors from a distant, unimagined future would one day travel great distances and pay considerable money simply to look at and admire. There is a kind of quiet, humbling symmetry in that thought, one worth sitting with for a moment before we bring this evening's journey to its close. The ordinary, ongoing texture of anyone's daily life and daily labor, whatever era we happen to occupy, rarely feels remarkable while we are living inside it. It simply feels like Tuesday, like breakfast needing to be prepared, like a wall needing one more careful pass with an abrasive stone, like children needing to be watched while chores get done. And yet this ordinary texture is, in the end, most of what actually constitutes history, far more of it than the relatively rare, dramatic events that tend to get remembered and celebrated afterward. Let's bring this particular fire down to its final quiet embers now, and spend a few last minutes simply reflecting together on everything this mountain has shown us tonight. A few quiet thoughts before we close, so let's just sit with all of this for a moment, quietly, the way you might sit with the last warmth of a fire after the flames themselves have died down to embers. We started tonight with a supposedly dramatic discovery, a lost city found by accident, and I hope by now that phrase feels a little different to you than it did at the beginning of this episode. Nothing about Machu Picchu was ever truly lost, not in the way that phrase usually implies. It was built over years of exacting, anonymous labor, by an empire at the height of its confidence and ambition. It was lived in, for generations, by farmers and weavers and priests and children, people whose names we will mostly never know, but whose daily rhythms, waking to a cold morning fire, grinding maize for breakfast, spinning thread while watching over younger siblings, patiently smoothing a single stone joint until it satisfied an exacting master's careful fingers, were every bit as real and vivid as anything happening in your own life tonight. It was abandoned slowly, quietly, likely without any single dramatic final day, as the wider empire that had sustained it collapsed under the weight of disease, civil war, and foreign conquest arriving almost simultaneously, a combination of catastrophes that would have overwhelmed nearly any society, anywhere, at any point in history. And then it simply waited for 3.5 centuries, visited occasionally by local farming families who never entirely forgot it was there, until an American historian, tired, slightly feverish, and looking for an entirely different ruin altogether, was led up a wet mountain trail by a farmer working for 50 cents and a family of children who already knew every stone of the place better than he ever would. I think there is something worth carrying with you from this story, something beyond the simple historical facts we have walked through tonight. It is this: significance is rarely obvious from the inside of an ordinary moment. The people who built these terraces, who wove these textiles, who chewed coca leaves by an evening fire while telling old stories to sleepy children, had no way of knowing that their lives would eventually be studied, admired, and gently reimagined by people living centuries later, on the other side of an ocean, in a world so different from theirs that they would barely recognize it. And yet here we are, still thinking about them, still trying imperfectly to understand what an ordinary Tuesday might have felt like on their mountain. Perhaps centuries from now, someone will wonder the same thing about us. What did an ordinary evening actually feel like, they might ask, for the people living through this particular moment in history, whatever moment that turns out to be. What small, unremarkable rituals filled their days? What quiet comforts helped them fall asleep at the end of a long one? I hope, wherever you are listening from tonight, that you are close to that kind of quiet comfort yourself right now. If your eyes have already closed, that is exactly where they should be. If they are still open, let them close now slowly, and let the last of this story settle over you like a heavy woven blanket against a cold mountain night. There is nowhere else you need to be. There is nothing else you need to remember. Just the mountain, the mist below it, and the quiet, ordinary lives that once filled it, one patient stone at a time. If you made it this far, and I suspect a good number of you drifted off somewhere along the way, which is exactly what this channel is for, thank you for spending this quiet evening with me and with this mountain. If you enjoyed this slow walk through history, consider subscribing to The Quiet Past and maybe leave this playing softly in the background as you drift off completely. There are more of these stories waiting here, other ordinary mornings in other overlooked corners of history, whenever you are ready for another one. Sleep well, and I will see you back here again soon by the fire.